Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Productions channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another Album of the Week episode. This is episode number 244. And so for today's episode, I am here to celebrate the 40th anniversary for Crusader, the 6th consecutive studio album for the Stallions of the Highway, Saxon. Originally released on April 16th, 1984 via both Carrere Records and EMI. And so without further ado, let's begin. With The Power and the Glory, an album that still retained its metal drive, felt like a transition towards a larger commercial market that core fans were feeling, to which ended up being the case with what would become their 6th studio album. However, the band's musical shift wasn't the only thing transitioning. The band was beginning to part ways with Carrere Records, to which it would soon quickly open up the doors to EMI. So to hone down this musical shift, they were handed with an American producer, Kevin Beamish, who is best known for working with bands like Y&T, Leatherwolf, Macaulay Schenker Group, Jefferson Starship, and REO Speedwagon, to produce the band's 6th studio album. The band would soon record the album in late 1983 at Sound City in Venice, located in Los Angeles. About 11 songs were recorded, with 9 songs and 1 intro being chosen, leaving the songs Helter Skelter, not a Beatles cover by the way, and Borderline to be kept in the vaults until 2009 for the album's remastered reissue. By April 16th, 1984, Crusader, a title that, according to original bass player Steve Dawson explains, in England there's a paper called the Daily Express, and on the logo at the top of the paper, there's a Crusader, and there was a car made by Ford called a Cortina Crusader. That's what started it off. We just liked the name Crusader. We didn't have any connotations of what it meant as far as history goes, but we just liked the name Crusader. So we just wrote the lyrics to fit the title, really. And, well, from there, the album was released. So, featuring 10 tracks, clocking at the length of 39 minutes and 10 seconds, these 10 tracks are, well, kicking off with the rather short instrumental or intro whatever that's titled The Crusader Prelude, which eventually leads into the title track. And then from there, we get a little bit of What You Fancy, Sailing to America, the sweet cover, Set Me Free, and then Just Let Me Rock, Bad Boys Like to Rock and Roll, Do It All For You, Rock City, and then ending with Run For Your Lives. So there you go, folks. There's your 10 tracks for Crusader. So, with the previous album, Power and the Glory, being somewhat seen as a sort of venture into more commercial, very melodic territories, this still was received fairly well from the core Saxon fan base, or the audience, whatever, depending on what was the verbiage that was used back in the 1980s. However, what this, of course, did was pretty much lead into basically what eventually they would just fully adapt with Crusader. And, well, when this album was released, let's just say that the same reception that the core fans had towards this album was quite different. This album to me has been a grower. I still don't hold it as high up in my Saxon albums list ranking for my favorite albums from them, but it isn't quite the turd that many had made it out to be. Yeah, that was a little bit of a harsh word to kind of use, or a term to kind of describe the album, or at least what many felt about it, but you get what I mean. However, if there is really one thing that many of us will agree on, is that the title track, a track written about the Christian soldiers who invaded Islamic lands in the 12th century. And according to singer Biff Byford, this is what he had to say about the concept for the song. It's what we used to learn at school. We used to read about the Crusaders back in the day. Richard the Lionheart, and all these figures that obviously weren't as fantastic as people, make out they are. It's a song written from a young boy's point of view, watching the knights and soldiers leave for crusade, basically. And what it's about. It's a third-person song, and he wants to go with the knights and his father or his uncles or who are going off to the crusade, and he can't because he's too young. That's the idea behind the song. Anyways, it's easily the most iconic song off of the album, one that they continue to play live. But there are some other songs here that I've grown to like the rather corny yet ridiculously catchy boogie rock of A Little Bit of What You Fancy, the badass cover of The Sweets' Set Me Free, which, by the way, Saxon owns here. Then we have the caveman strut of Just Let Me Rock, and of course even the album closer, Run For Your Lives. To me, these are the absolute highlights for the album and are the only ones that come across as being classic Saxon, especially some that wouldn't be too far off, let's say if they had fit in line with some of the previous other albums, because it's still in that sort of same vein and they're great. But besides that, the title track really is one that feels more epic and grandiose, and it's what really kind of fits, even to this day, even newer Saxon, if you really put it that way. So it really has that edge to it, and it's perfect. So now this brings me to the cons of the album. Yes, there's cons for the album. Those were, to me, the absolute bright spots. So here, the cons to which are technically the remainder of the songs for this album. I mean, which are not exactly terrible, just feel like filler and don't do very much for me, especially within the case of Bad Boys, parentheses, Like to Rock and Roll, and Rock City. The songs, Sailing to America and Do It All For You, which, by the way, crazy fact, the intro for Do It All For You used to be the intro for Stand Up and Be Counted before they basically scrapped the intro part when they were recording Wheels of Steel. But the intro was used back in like 1978, and they actually had first recorded it in 1978 with this intro that eventually got used for Do It All For You. And you can find this original version of Stand Up and Be Counted on the Diamonds and Nuggets Rarities disc. Now, still, to kind of go further again, I was just like digressing and shit. These two songs, in a way, feel like a harbinger for the writing that would become, for the next few albums. But here, I just feel they just come across as unrealized and way underdeveloped. If only they decided to take away two of these filler tracks, replaced them in favor of the two they had kept off, those being Borderline and Helter Skelter. I would feel that if they had been kept in and they had replaced, or just gotten rid of the two songs I just feel are filler, for example, Bad Boys Like to Rock and Roll and Rock City, I think this album would have had at least they would have saved it for me, as what I'm kind of getting at. So there you have it. Finally, my last real con for this album is Kevin Beamish's production, which is just tinny, malnourished, and has no bottom end. And it just feels damn flat and just lifeless. Which is a shame because Kevin Beamish has a few good sounding albums. But this just wasn't it. Absolutely not. If only this was produced by, again, Jeff Glicksman, who had produced Power and the Glory. I know there are some that have knocked that album for his production, whatever, you know. But still, at least that album had something behind it. But even then, you can also have, I wish they have at least gotten like the Tom Allom or Dennis McKay. Again, if you don't know what Dennis McKay is, he's the guy that produced Stained Class for Judas Priest, Tigers of Pantang's Crazy Nights, and Crash and Burn from Pat Travers. So he's had at least some good sounding albums under him, and I just feel like if he had produced this album, I think it would have had a much more fuller sound instead of sounding completely tinny and just too squeaky clean, and it just ruins, I think, the songs on the album, takes away the grit of them. If they had at least gotten those two producers like I'm kind of going on here and to kind of, you know, end it off, then I feel that even the okayish sounding songs would have had some power behind them if they had been produced by the two names I had mentioned. It would have at least resonated better with me. But because it's Kevin Beamish and his production style for the album, it leaves a lot to be desired is what I'm getting at. So there you have it. But either way, even with my nitpicks for this album, I still find it enjoyable. It has its moments of greatness, but because the band was beginning to further experiment with going more melodic and commercial sounding, it tends to feel uneven, and it just autopilots itself, waiting to just reach the end of its destination. So, Crusader may not be my all-time favorite album for, well, the Stallions of the Highway or Militia Guard or the Fathers of the Denim and Leather, whatever sort of term that you want to basically summarize Saxon as. Still, it's still an album that has been growing on me for quite some time. I mean, I've had this album since 2014. I mean, I have it basically a part of this set right here, which I had purchased in like early November of 2014 when this was actually released. So I've had it since then, and since then again, it's just been growing on me, and I can kind of understand why many at least felt about the album, but it still does have its fair share of, well, fans, and those who, in a way, still like this album. However, there's definitely no denying that with this album, all this meant was it was pretty much leading into something much more, way more elaborate. They were going to really pursue more with the more commercial sound and everything. I mean, 1984, and then by 1985, the whole musical shift within the sort of hard rock heavy metal was changing, and a lot of bands were getting bigger, and some of the bands that were getting bigger, you know, were some of the sort of glammy and hair metal bands, and of course Def Leppard and so on. Well, that's what eventually leads into the follow-up. Innocence is no excuse. Now, my thoughts for this album? Well, I'll save those thoughts for next year when I basically cover this album around its 40th anniversary. But until then, again, it is Crusader. And so for those who obviously have lived and spent years listening to this album, or even not just longtime fans, but anybody that have listened to Crusader, if you have any thoughts, whether they are either positive or negative, you can leave them all down in the comments section below. But for those who have yet to check out Crusader and are on the fence of whether or not you should venture into checking this album out, knowing what this album leads to, and it's definitely a period that isn't considered very favorably, but it is one that exists, and here and there, it does have at least has its way of making their realms or the rays, into the set list for Saxon these days, and Saxon sound has obviously been changed to something far more different, much more heavier these days, but here and there, this area, this period does manage to live within Saxon. So if you're kind of, again, on the fence, don't hesitate. I think it's definitely worth checking out, and whether you like it or not is up to you. So with that, this is Heavy Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.